Yo, what is going on, guys? Today I'm going to show you guys how I made this really cool epoxy ocean end table with farmhouse style legs, and I'm also using sand from Greece. Alright guys, so before I jump into the video, I just wanted to share my design with you guys so that you guys can actually see what it is that I'm actually building. Obviously I'm making a different tabletop than the one shown here. But if you are interested in the detailed plans for this, you can check that out down in the description. But with that being said, let's start building. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up my stop block on my miter saw station. That way I can cut 6 perfectly equal 2x4s. I made this miter saw station in my last video and it works extremely well. I lined up all the boards and you can see just how accurate the cuts came out. Next, I ran all the boards through the planer just to get it as flat as possible, and I planed it down to about 1¼ inches thick. After I got the boards planed down, I started by gluing up 3 boards at a time. That way I could fit them in my planer, and then later I could go back and glue up the 2 halves together. I ended up cutting my boards about 1 inch or 2 long just to account for any planer snipe that might have happened, and then I could go back and trim the edges. And it's probably better to just use a table saw to trim up the edges, but I decided to just use my stop block system and my miter saw to make this edge cut. Here I'm just ripping down some 2x4s to create the trim, and because this wood is so soft, I end up having to put masking tape on the ends where I'm doing the miter cuts, and that just kind of keeps it from splintering. Right here I'm just pre-drilling some holes for where the screws are gonna go. And the whole idea for this table is to make it look like it's framed in, almost like a picture frame. And then once I lay down the epoxy beach, I'll pour clear all the way up to the top, and that'll give it that really cool 3D effect. After the glue dries, I go back and remove all of the screws, and then I take my drill and I drill out about a 3/8 inch hole about 1 to 2 inches deep, and then I'll glue up some dowels and drive those in. And this isn't completely necessary, but I really like the look of dowels, especially when they're equally spaced. and once you stain it, it has the end grain of the dowels and it looks really cool. Once all the dowels have dried, I cut it with my flush trim saw, and then I come back in with my orbital sander and I sand down all the edges. The table came out perfectly square, and I really like the look of the mitered edges. And right now I'm just prepping it, trying to get all the dust out, getting it ready for the first round of epoxy. So my girlfriend is actually Greek, and she had this jar of sand in our house that she actually collected from different beaches from the island of Andros in Greece, which is also where her dad grew up. And every day I would walk by it, and it gave me the idea to make an ocean table with it, and she also loved the idea too, so she let me use it, and we are both super happy with the way it came out. I ended up getting a little bit scared once I mixed the epoxy with the sand because it got really dark and it almost looked like concrete at first, but over time as it dried up it ended up getting a lot lighter. Before I actually poured the sand into the table, I actually took a pencil and I kind of drew an outline of what I wanted the sand to look like, and then I just kind of used a popsicle stick to help shape it. I used 2 different shades of blue for the ocean, and I will put links in the description for all the products that I used. Now I know it looks super silly and y'all are probably wondering like, why is he using the tiniest cup to do these pours, and that's just because I did this really late at night and these are the only disposable cups I had were these little tiny red Solo cup shot glasses, and I didn't feel like running to the store, so this is what we used. So full disclaimer, this is actually my very first time actually making an epoxy ocean end table, and I am by no means an artist or anything like that, and there are plenty of great YouTube tutorials on how to do these things, but this is just kind of how I did it. I made a few mistakes along the way, but I think at the end of the day it came out pretty cool. So right here I'm just hitting the epoxy with a heat gun, just trying to get out any of the bubbles that might be in there. And then after that I go in there with my hand and I try to blend in the light blue and the dark blue just to try to make it look more like an ocean. Once the blue dries, you can see how well it blended together, and now I'm just throwing clear resin over the whole thing, and this is going to help for when I put the white down, so that the white has the clear resin to get pushed over so it can actually form and create cells. Here I am applying just the first layer of waves, and then I'm going to take my heat gun and I'm going to push that white over the clear resin, and that's going to form the cells to make it look more like an actual ocean wave. And everything came out pretty good. The only problem I ran into is that because I have walls around the epoxy, there was nowhere for the epoxy to push over and fall off, and instead it would bounce off the walls and then kind of pull back and retrace itself. So I did get a lot of cells, but I didn't get as much as I wanted. So like I said before, this is my first time doing any type of epoxy ocean, and there's a lot of other people on YouTube that can make this much more realistic than I can. But I think for my first try I learned a lot, and I think it still came out pretty nice. It's kind of hard to see, but while the epoxy was drying, I actually reached up to grab a tool off my pegboard, and that tool had a bunch of sawdust on it, and when I picked it up, a ton of sawdust fell onto the epoxy while it was drying, and it made me freak out a little bit. But I just ended up letting it dry out completely, and I waited like 2 or 3 days because I needed it to fully cure before I could sand it down. And then I was able to go and sand out all the fine dust that dropped into the epoxy. And then after I sanded it all down, I filled the whole tabletop up with clear epoxy. I made sure the tabletop was as level as possible, and then after I filled it up, I hit any remaining bubbles with the torch, and while that was curing for a few days, I started making the table legs. In order to make the half lap joint, I use a rafter square to help me find the angle, and then I put the board up to it and line it up parallel, and now I know what material I need to cut out. There are many different ways to cut a half lap joint, but my favorite way is just to take it over to the miter saw and set my depth gauge, and then just take several passes through the piece of wood, and then hog out the material with the hammer, and then come back to the miter saw and clean up the edges. Now I'm just doing a dry fit just to make sure that everything fits, and anytime you do a half lap joint, you want to make sure that that joint is as tight as possible. And then after this, I'll throw some Titebond 2 glue on it and I'll clamp it down. After the table legs have dried, it was now time to glue the table legs to the table feet, and I'm just using glue and brad nails to hold it together. Now that the assembly of the legs is complete, I can now attach the horizontal stretcher to the bottom of the table legs, and I'm just using glue and dowels for this. Now, when I originally designed these table legs, I only had one horizontal stretcher at the bottom towards the feet, and after it dried up, I realized it wasn't as quite strong as I wanted it to be, so I decided to add this middle support in between the X's, and for that I just used glue and I used my brad nailer again. Before I started painting, I went and patched all the nail holes, and I'm using this plastic wood filler, and when you put it on it's pink and then it dries brown, and then you sand it off and you can't even notice it. I was going to use my new spray gun for this project, but it didn't end up coming in time, so instead I just ended up putting 2 coats of latex paint on it. I made sure to put on really thin coats, that way I didn't have any paint drip. Now that the table legs were drying, it was time to get back to work on the tabletop. I sanded it all down, and I took my belt sander to the table, and it was kind of aggressive and it made a bunch of little tiny pinholes, so I had to go back with quick setting epoxy and fill in all those holes, and then go back with my orbital sander and sand it all down, but it ended up working out nice. I wanted to keep the nice look of the mitered edges, so I decided to just hand sand all the corners and then come back with a 1/4 inch round over all the sides. Before I got started polishing the epoxy, I wanted to apply my stain, and I'm just using Minwax's walnut stain. And before I put the stain on, I also put Minwax's pre-stain conditioner on, and that just makes the stain go on way more even. After the stain had dried, I brushed on some semi-gloss polyurethane on both sides. So I'm not going to show you guys the whole sanding process, but I ended up wet sanding the whole table starting from 320 grit and working my way up to 1200 grit. And then after that I used card polish and tried to polish the epoxy. and it made it much more clear, but it wasn't as clear as I wanted it to be. And at this point I didn't know what I was gonna do, so I ended up putting polyurethane as a top coat over the whole thing, and it made it crystal clear. You can definitely see how foggy the tabletop is before I put on the polyurethane, and I wasn't even sure that you could put oil-based polyurethane over epoxy, and I looked it up on the internet and I couldn't really find anything. I could find stuff for water-based polyurethane but not oil-based polyurethane, and I was like, alright, I'm just gonna go for it, and I put that on it and it dried crystal clear, and I'm really happy that it did. Alright, so before I install the tabletop, the first thing I want to do is go ahead and flip it over, and I'm going to install these felt pads. I'm probably going to put one on each corner, and then I'm probably going to put one of these long ones across this straight bar right here. Okay guys, so before I show you guys the ocean side of the tabletop, I flipped it over on its backside, and this is what it looks like just as is from the backside. And if any of you guys are interested in getting the plans that look like this, I do have these available on my Etsy page. Thank you guys for watching. I really like the way this table turned out. Please be sure to smash that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you guys on the next one.